The room always remembers the woman a man tried to erase. The chandeliers of the Sterling Foundation Gala spilled warm gold across the marble ballroom as the quiet hum of money and power floated through the air, glasses of champagne clinking like distant bells, and at the center of the crowd stood Ryan Blake, confident and polished in a tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than the average American's monthly mortgage payment, smiling beside his wife Sophia Hart, the same runway model he had married a decade earlier after a divorce that had once made society headlines, a divorce that ended with a woman named Emily Carter signing the papers through tears while Ryan walked away with the certainty that his life was only beginning. For 10 years Ryan had believed that story completely. He had built a thriving real estate empire across Manhattan, appeared in glossy magazines, and hosted charity galas like this one where the city's wealthiest investors gathered beneath crystal chandeliers the size of small cars. Sophia thrived in this world, her elegance effortless, her smile always angled toward the cameras that followed them from one event to another. Tonight was no different. The orchestra played softly near the stage, investors traded quiet deals near the bar, and Ryan raised his champagne glass while listening to a board member praise his latest luxury development overlooking the Hudson River. Everything in the room reflected success, the kind of success Ryan had always believed he deserved. And then the ballroom doors opened. At first it was subtle, just a shift in the air, a ripple through the crowd like wind brushing across still water. Conversation slowed. A few heads turned toward the entrance. Ryan didn't notice at first. He was explaining a new project in Miami, a 40-story tower with ocean views and penthouse units starting at $5 million. But then the whispers began, soft at first, then spreading like electricity across the room. Someone near the entrance gasped quietly. Another voice murmured a name. Ryan frowned slightly and turned his head. What he saw made the champagne glass slip slightly in his grip. A woman had just stepped into the ballroom, her presence calm and composed, wearing a deep emerald evening gown that moved like liquid silk beneath the chandelier light. Her dark hair fell neatly over one shoulder, and her posture carried the quiet confidence of someone who no longer asked permission to exist in rooms like this. Ryan felt something strange tighten in his chest because he recognized that face instantly. Emily Carter, the woman he had divorced 10 years ago. For a moment his mind rejected what his eyes were seeing. The Emily he remembered had been soft-spoken, uncertain, the kind of woman who faded into the background at events like this. But the woman standing in the doorway now was different. She didn't look lost or intimidated. She looked like she belonged. And she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was Daniel Sterling, the billionaire investor whose foundation was hosting tonight's gala, a man whose quiet influence shaped entire industries across the country. His hand rested gently at the small of Emily's back as he guided her forward, the crowd instinctively parting to make room for them. But what truly silenced the room were the 3 children walking just ahead of them, identical boys dressed in matching navy suits, their small hands confidently linked with their mothers. Triplets. Ryan's heart skipped once, sharply, as the realization struck him like cold air. The room had gone completely still now. Investors, executives, and socialites stared openly, whispering Emily's name with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Ryan felt Sophia's hand tighten slightly around his arm, but he barely noticed. Because Emily Carter, the woman he once believed he had left behind forever, was now walking toward the center of the ballroom beside one of the most powerful men in America, with 3 children who carried the Sterling name. And in that moment Ryan Blake understood something he had never expected to feel again: uncertainty. Ryan Blake could not look away. The orchestra continued playing somewhere behind him, a soft piano melody floating across the marble floor, but the music felt distant now, like something happening in another room. His attention was locked on Emily Carter as she moved calmly through the crowd beside Daniel Sterling, the billionaire host of the evening, whose presence alone commanded quiet respect in rooms filled with power. 10 years. That was how long it had been since Ryan had last seen her face. Yet the memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. A courthouse in lower Manhattan on a gray November afternoon. Rain tapping against tall windows. Emily sitting across from him at a polished wooden table, her hands trembling slightly, as she held the pen that would end their marriage. Ryan had not been cruel that day. At least that was how he remembered it. He had simply been certain. certain that his life was moving forward and that Emily belonged to a chapter that no longer fit the future he imagined. Back then he had been building the first towers of his real estate company, chasing investors, attending every networking event he could find. Emily had always preferred quieter things. Bookstores, museums, small dinners with friends. Ryan used to joke that she was built for a slower life, while he was built for a skyline. When he met Sophia Hart during a charity runway event in Los Angeles, the difference between the two women seemed obvious to him. Sophia understood the spotlight. She moved through luxury hotels and social events as if she had been born inside them. Emily had never tried to compete with that world. In fact, she had quietly stepped away from it. The divorce papers had been finalized within a month. Ryan remembered the headlines that followed when he married Sophia the next spring at a beachfront ceremony in Malibu. The photographs had traveled across every social media feed in the country. Sophia in a flowing white gown. Ryan smiling beside her under a California sunset. Reporters called them one of the most glamorous couples in New York business circles. Emily Carter disappeared almost immediately after the divorce. At first Ryan assumed she had simply moved somewhere quieter, perhaps to a small town or another state. A few mutual friends mentioned that she had stopped answering calls. Her social media accounts vanished. Her apartment lease ended. Within a year people stopped mentioning her name entirely. Ryan had not searched for her. Not because he was angry, because he believed there was nothing left to find. And yet now she was here, not standing awkwardly at the edge of the ballroom the way Ryan remembered her during his early corporate events. She moved through the room with calm assurance, greeting several investors who clearly recognized her. Daniel Sterling leaned slightly closer as she spoke, listening to her with an attention that was impossible to miss. Ryan felt Sophia shift beside him again, following his gaze toward the approaching group. The three children walked confidently beside Emily, their identical dark hair catching the chandelier light as they studied the enormous ballroom with curious eyes. One of the boys laughed quietly at something Daniel said, and Emily smiled down at him with a warmth Ryan had not seen in many years. The crowd was no longer whispering now. They were watching, waiting. Because Daniel Sterling and Emily Carter were walking directly toward the center of the room, toward the small circle where Ryan Blake and Sophia Hart were standing. And with every quiet step Emily took across the marble floor, Ryan felt the strange certainty that the story he believed had ended 10 years ago was about to begin again. Ryan Blake felt the room tighten as Emily Carter and Daniel Sterling stepped into the circle of investors and executives who had been speaking with him only moments earlier. The marble floor seemed suddenly louder beneath every step, the quiet tap of shoes echoing beneath the chandeliers. Conversations around the ballroom faded into cautious silence as people turned their attention toward the approaching group. Daniel Sterling was not a man people ignored. His companies shaped transportation networks, technology infrastructure, and investment markets across the country. When he walked into a room, attention followed naturally. Yet tonight, it was not only Daniel who captured the room. It was the woman beside him. Emily stopped only a few feet from Ryan, her expression calm, composed, the same quiet confidence she had carried since stepping through the ballroom doors. For a brief second their eyes met. Ryan expected to see anger or resentment, perhaps the fragile hurt he remembered from the courthouse a decade earlier. Instead, there was only steady composure, the kind that comes from a life that has moved forward without waiting for permission. Daniel's voice broke the silence with an easy warmth that carried across the small circle of onlookers. He greeted several investors first, shaking hands, exchanging quick words about projects and partnerships. Then his attention turned toward Ryan. Daniel studied him for a moment with polite curiosity before extending his hand. Ryan forced a professional smile and accepted the handshake automatically, the same practiced gesture he had repeated thousands of times at business events. Daniel's grip was calm and firm, the kind of handshake that belonged to someone entirely comfortable with his place in the world. Sophia stood slightly behind Ryan now, her posture still elegant but noticeably quieter as she observed the exchange. Around them, more guests drifted closer, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The three boys stepped slightly forward beside Emily, their small polished shoes reflecting the chandelier light on the marble floor. One of them looked up at Daniel and asked a quiet question about the orchestra playing near the stage. Daniel bent slightly to answer him with a gentle smile, speaking with the kind patience that surprised several people standing nearby. Then he straightened again and placed a light hand on Emily's shoulder. The gesture was simple but unmistakably protective. Daniel looked toward the gathered guests and spoke in a voice calm enough to command the entire room without raising it. He said that before the evening continued, he wanted to properly introduce someone very important to him. The murmuring in the ballroom faded completely. Emily stood beside him, composed and radiant beneath the gold light of the chandeliers. Daniel's hand remained resting lightly at her shoulder as he continued speaking, his tone filled with unmistakable pride. He said that the woman standing beside him was not only the reason he believed in the future of the foundation they had built together, but also the person who had brought the greatest joy into his life. Several people already recognized the name Daniel was about to say. Others leaned slightly closer, curious and uncertain. Daniel then introduced her simply and clearly as his wife, Emily Sterling. A ripple moved through the crowd, soft gasps mixed with quiet recognition. The name traveled across the ballroom in whispers that reached even the farthest corners of the room. Emily Sterling. Daniel then gently motioned toward the three boys standing beside her and explained that they were their sons, the future heirs of the Sterling family. Ryan Blake felt the words land with unexpected weight as he looked again at the children, their identical faces bright beneath the chandelier light. And in that moment he realized that the quiet woman he once believed had disappeared from his life had not vanished at all. She had simply walked forward into a future far larger than anything he had ever imagined. The applause began slowly at first, a polite ripple moving through the ballroom, but it quickly grew stronger as more guests realized the significance of Daniel Sterling's announcement. The orchestra resumed its gentle melody, yet the music seemed secondary to the quiet energy now circulating through the crowd. Investors stepped forward to greet Daniel, offering congratulations with respectful smiles, and several turned immediately toward Emily Sterling with curiosity that bordered on admiration. Only moments earlier, she had been a mystery entering the room. Now she was clearly one of its most important figures. Emily acknowledged each greeting with calm warmth, her voice steady, her posture graceful as she introduced the boys beside her. The triplets listened attentively as adults spoke to them, their identical expressions filled with a mixture of curiosity and confidence that seemed far older than their years. One guest asked their names, and Emily answered gently, explaining that they were named Alexander, Julian, and Theodore. The names moved through the small crowd like a soft echo, repeated quietly by those who were trying to place the new family within the intricate social map of the city's elite. Ryan Blake remained still where he stood, the weight of the moment pressing quietly against his chest. 10 years earlier, he had believed he understood exactly how the story had ended. Emily Carter had been the quiet chapter he had closed while chasing a louder future beside Sophia Hart. Yet the woman standing across the marble floor tonight did not resemble the memory he carried. She was composed in a way that suggested years of quiet strength rather than quiet defeat. Ryan noticed how easily Daniel spoke to her, how naturally he included her in every conversation as an equal partner rather than a silent companion. Several board members from the foundation approached next, greeting Emily with familiarity that revealed she had been involved in the organization far longer than tonight's introduction suggested. One of them mentioned a recent educational initiative that had expanded scholarship programs across several states, praising Emily for the work she had quietly led behind the scenes. Another guest spoke about a hospital wing that had recently opened with funding from the Sterling Foundation, explaining that Emily had personally helped design the family support programs attached to it. The information settled slowly across the crowd as people began to understand that Emily Sterling was not simply Daniel's wife appearing for the first time in public. She had already been shaping the foundation's work for years. Ryan glanced briefly at Sophia, who was watching the scene with a carefully controlled smile that did not quite reach her eyes. For the first time that evening, Ryan felt something he had rarely experienced in business negotiations or public events. It was not anger. It was not regret exactly. It was the unsettling realization that the woman he once believed he had left behind had built an entirely different world without him noticing. Emily turned again toward the boys, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from Alexander's forehead as he asked another question about the musicians playing near the stage. Daniel smiled down at the children before looking back toward the guests gathering around them. The warmth in his expression suggested something deeper than pride. It was the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly how fortunate he was. And as Ryan watched the small family standing together beneath the gold light of the chandeliers, he began to understand that the life he once considered his greatest victory might not have been the story's final chapter at all. The gala slowly returned to its rhythm, yet the atmosphere had subtly shifted, like a room that had quietly realized it had witnessed something unexpected. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne, while the orchestra continued its soft melody near the stage. But the conversations that filled the ballroom now carried a different tone. People were no longer speaking only about investments, partnerships, or the newest luxury developments rising along the skyline. They were speaking about Emily Sterling. Ryan Blake could hear fragments of those conversations drifting through the air around him. Several investors were discussing the scholarship initiative Emily had helped launch. Another group mentioned a new community hospital wing funded through the Sterling Foundation. The more Ryan listened, the more he realized that Emily had not simply returned to public life tonight. She had been building influence quietly for years, shaping projects that reached far beyond the business circles Ryan had always believed defined success. Emily stood a few yards away now speaking with a group of foundation donors. Her voice calm and warm as she explained the expansion of an education program that supported first-generation college students across several states. Her words carried quiet conviction, the kind that comes from someone who has lived through difficult seasons and understands the value of opportunity. The three boys stood nearby, listening politely while occasionally glancing toward the orchestra with the restless curiosity of children surrounded by a room full of adults. Daniel Sterling watched them with an expression that blended pride and gentle amusement, occasionally bending down to answer one of their questions before returning his attention to the guests gathered around them. Ryan studied the scene with growing awareness. The woman he once remembered as uncertain had become someone entirely different. She did not speak loudly, and she did not seek attention, yet the people around her listened carefully. They respected her. They trusted her. That quiet authority was something Ryan recognized immediately because it was the same quality he had spent years trying to cultivate in his own career. Sophia shifted beside him again, her gaze moving between the crowd and Emily with careful observation. For the first time that evening, Ryan noticed a hint of tension in her posture, as if she were measuring the room in a way she had never needed to before. The spotlight she had once commanded so easily now seemed to belong somewhere else. Across the ballroom, Emily finished speaking with the donors and gently gathered the boys closer, preparing to guide them toward the dessert table where small plates of fruit and pastries were arranged beneath soft golden lights. One of the boys laughed quietly as Daniel lifted him briefly so he could see the towering chocolate display shaped like the skyline of New York City. The moment was simple and ordinary, yet it carried a warmth that drew several smiles from nearby guests. Ryan watched them together and felt a realization slowly settle into place. 10 years earlier, he had believed success meant moving faster, climbing higher, surrounding himself with louder symbols of achievement. Yet the quiet confidence surrounding Emily now suggested a different kind of victory. She had not returned tonight to prove anything to him. She had returned simply because this had become her world. And as Ryan stood beneath the glow of the chandeliers listening to the gentle laughter of the three boys who carried the Sterling name, he began to understand that the life he once believed he had outgrown might have been the very foundation of something far greater than he had ever recognized. The dessert table soon became the quiet center of the evening for the youngest guests in the ballroom, its glass tiers reflecting the chandelier light, while small plates of pastries and fruit created a colorful display that drew the triplets closer. With growing excitement, Alexander pointed toward the chocolate skyline sculpture, while Julian carefully studied a plate of strawberries, as if evaluating an important decision, and Theodore asked Daniel whether the musicians ever played faster songs during events like this. Daniel answered each question with easy patience, kneeling slightly, so his voice met the boys at eye level. Emily watched them with a calm smile that carried a warmth the surrounding guests noticed immediately. Several donors who had come to speak with Daniel paused instead to greet the children, their serious business expressions softening into genuine curiosity. One woman complimented Emily on how polite the boys were, explaining that it was rare to see children so comfortable in a formal room filled with powerful adults. Emily thanked her quietly and explained that the boys had grown up around foundation events, often accompanying her when she visited schools and hospitals connected to their programs. The donor nodded with interest and asked about the projects Emily had mentioned earlier. Emily spoke thoughtfully about the scholarship initiative again, explaining how the program had started with just 20 students 5 years earlier and had now expanded to more than 200 across several states. As she spoke, Ryan Blake found himself listening more carefully than he expected. Each detail revealed another piece of a life he had never imagined Emily building after the divorce. She spoke about traveling to small towns in Ohio and Michigan where families worked 2 jobs just to support their children through high school. She described the moment a student opened a college acceptance letter and realized an entire future had suddenly become possible. The room around her seemed to quiet again as several guests leaned closer, drawn not by dramatic words, but by the sincerity in her voice. Ryan remembered the early years of their marriage when Emily had always cared about causes like education and community support. At the time, he had considered those interests admirable, but distant from the world he was trying to conquer. Listening now, he realized that what once seemed quiet had grown into something powerful. Sophia watched the exchange with careful composure, occasionally lifting her champagne glass while observing the guests who now circled Emily with increasing respect. The spotlight that had once followed Sophia through fashion events and magazine features now seemed to settle naturally around the calm figure standing beside the dessert table. Daniel eventually joined the conversation again, placing a reassuring hand on Emily's back as he thanked the donors for their continued support of the foundation's work. His tone carried quiet pride when he spoke about the programs Emily had helped design, describing her as the reason many of the initiatives had grown beyond their original plans. The words caused several guests to glance at Emily with renewed admiration. Ryan felt the shift in the room once more. It was subtle but undeniable. People were not simply acknowledging Daniel Sterling's success. They were recognizing Emily as a central part of it. As the boys finally selected small desserts and gathered beside their parents again, laughter rose softly around them. The moment felt relaxed and genuine, far removed from the tense curiosity that had filled the ballroom earlier. Ryan watched the small family standing together beneath the warm light and felt an unfamiliar sense of reflection settle over him. 10 years earlier, he had believed he was stepping into a future that would leave his past far behind. Yet as he listened to the quiet conversation around Emily and saw the respect she now commanded, he began to understand that the woman he once thought had disappeared had in fact been building a life strong enough to reshape the room itself. The evening continued to unfold with the smooth elegance that defined every Sterling Foundation event. Yet beneath the music and soft conversations, a quiet awareness lingered across the ballroom. Guests who had arrived expecting another predictable charity gala now found themselves drawn repeatedly toward the same small circle near the center of the room, where Emily Sterling stood with Daniel and the 3 boys. The attention was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle, the way important currents often move quietly beneath the surface. Emily had stepped away briefly from the dessert table and now stood speaking with a group of university representatives who had traveled from several states to attend the gala. They listened closely as she discussed expanding the scholarship program into rural communities that had been overlooked for decades. Her voice carried a calm certainty that made the idea feel not only possible, but inevitable. Daniel watched her with quiet admiration, occasionally adding a detail about the foundation's logistics or funding structure. But it was clear to anyone listening that the heart of the initiative belonged to Emily. Across the room, Ryan Blake stood near the bar with a glass of sparkling water he had barely touched. The condensation from the glass had begun to collect against his palm, but he did not notice. His attention remained fixed on Emily. For the first time in many years, Ryan was remembering details he had not thought about since the early days of their marriage. Emily sitting at their small apartment kitchen table late at night reading about education reform. Emily volunteering on weekends at a community tutoring center while Ryan attended networking dinners. At the time, he had admired her dedication but quietly assumed those passions would always remain small, personal things. Now he was watching the same woman lead conversations that involved millions of dollars in funding and hundreds of students whose futures depended on the decisions being discussed in this ballroom. Sophia stood beside him in silence for several seconds before finally speaking in a voice carefully neutral. She asked whether Ryan had known Emily would be here tonight. Ryan shook his head slowly. The truth was he had not even considered the possibility. In his mind, Emily had always remained part of a chapter that closed long ago. Sophia glanced again across the ballroom where several guests were laughing softly as one of the triplets proudly explained that he wanted to design buildings when he grew up. Daniel crouched beside the boy again, listening with genuine interest as the child described a skyscraper with glass walls and a rooftop garden taller than any building in New York City. The moment was lighthearted, but it drew another small circle of guests closer, smiling at the easy warmth of the family standing together. Ryan noticed the way Daniel occasionally looked toward Emily, as if checking that everything around her was comfortable and calm. It was not a possessive gesture. It was protective in the quietest sense. Ryan realized suddenly that he had never seen that expression on his own face during the years he was married to Emily. His attention had always been focused forward toward the next opportunity, the next project, the next step upward. As the orchestra shifted into a slightly livelier melody and waiters began circulating with fresh trays of desserts, the room settled again into conversation. Yet Ryan could feel the subtle shift that had taken place since Emily's arrival. The center of gravity in the ballroom had quietly moved, and it now rested around the woman he once believed had disappeared from his life forever. The music in the ballroom grew slightly brighter as the orchestra shifted into a lively jazz arrangement, the soft rhythm echoing gently across the marble floor while guests resumed conversations that now carried a new undercurrent of curiosity. Yet even as investors discussed market forecasts and donors compared notes about upcoming projects, attention continued to drift back toward the same place where Emily Sterling stood beside Daniel and their 3 sons. The boys had finished their desserts and were now studying the enormous glass windows that overlooked the glowing skyline of Manhattan, their reflections merging with the golden chandelier light behind them. Theodore pressed his small hand against the glass and whispered something about how the buildings looked like stars standing upright. Daniel laughed quietly and lifted him just enough so he could see farther across the city. The moment was simple but genuine, the kind that quietly softened the atmosphere around them. Emily watched the skyline as well for a moment before turning back toward a group of educators who had approached her with questions about the scholarship initiative. She listened carefully to their ideas about expanding the program into community colleges, nodding thoughtfully before offering suggestions that balanced ambition with practical steps. The discussion quickly drew more attention, and soon several business leaders joined the circle, asking how private investors might help strengthen the program's reach. Emily answered each question patiently, explaining how even small contributions could create long-term opportunities for students who had never imagined attending college. Ryan Blake stood several yards away listening to the conversation unfold. With each passing minute, he realized how completely Emily had stepped into a role that carried influence far beyond the quiet life he once associated with her. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning the details behind every project she mentioned. Nothing about her presence suggested a sudden transformation or a dramatic return. Instead, it felt like the natural result of steady growth that had taken place long before tonight's gala. Sophia noticed the same shift. She watched the growing circle around Emily with careful attention, her expression thoughtful rather than jealous. The admiration surrounding Emily was not the fleeting kind that followed fashion or celebrity. It was deeper, built on respect and shared purpose. Sophia quietly set down her empty glass and folded her hands, studying the scene as if seeing the evening through a new lens. Near the windows, Julian pointed toward a cluster of lights across the river and asked Daniel whether the foundation helped schools there too. Daniel explained that the program had recently expanded to include several districts in that area, and that Emily had personally visited one of the schools the previous spring. The boy listened with bright curiosity before announcing that when he grew up, he wanted to help design schools where every classroom had giant windows like the ones in the ballroom. Guests nearby smiled at the innocent declaration. Emily knelt beside him and gently explained that dreams like that often begin with simple ideas spoken out loud. Her voice carried quiet encouragement, the same tone she had used earlier when describing students receiving their first college acceptance letters. Ryan felt that moment settle into his thoughts. For years he had measured success through buildings, deals, and headlines. Yet as he watched Emily guide her sons with the same calm wisdom she offered to donors and educators, he realized that the influence surrounding her tonight was not built on attention alone. It was built on purpose. And in the warm light of the ballroom, beneath the reflection of a city that stretched miles into the night, Ryan Blake began to understand that the life Emily had quietly built was not simply impressive. It was meaningful in a way he had never stopped long enough to recognize. The evening settled into a calmer rhythm as the orchestra softened its tempo, and the city lights outside the tall windows shimmered across the glass like distant constellations. Conversations drifted through the ballroom again, but the quiet center of gravity remained around Emily Sterling and her family. Guests no longer approached her with simple curiosity. Now they came with genuine respect, eager to learn more about the programs she had quietly built over the past several years. One university president described how the foundation scholarships had changed the future of an entire rural district where fewer than 10 students had once gone to college each year. Emily listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about the students who had received those opportunities. Her attention was never rushed, never distracted. She spoke to each person as though their story mattered just as much as the next. Nearby, the triplets had begun studying a scale model of the city that had been placed near the window as part of the gala's architectural theme. Tiny towers and bridges stretched across the display, glowing softly beneath hidden lights. Alexander leaned closer and asked whether buildings could ever be designed so that every family had a garden on the roof. Daniel smiled at the idea and explained how some architects were already trying to create spaces where cities and nature could grow together. The boys listened with bright curiosity, their questions bouncing from design to science to the way light reflected across the river outside. Emily watched them with quiet affection before turning back toward the donors standing nearby. Ryan Blake remained near the bar, though he had long since forgotten the drink in his hand. His mind had begun tracing a different set of memories now. He remembered evenings in their first apartment when Emily had spoken about communities she hoped to help someday. Back then Ryan had listened with polite interest, already planning the next meeting or business opportunity that would move his career forward. The difference between those two ambitions had once seemed obvious. Tonight it felt far more complicated. Sophia stood beside him with her arms gently folded, her gaze thoughtful rather than distant. She finally spoke in a calm voice, observing that Emily seemed to know nearly everyone in the room. Ryan nodded slowly. The truth was that Emily did not simply know them. She had earned their trust. Across the ballroom, Daniel placed a reassuring hand against Emily's shoulder as another group approached to thank her for the work she had done with the foundation. One guest described how a scholarship recipient had recently returned home after graduating from college to open a medical clinic in the same community where he grew up. Emily's expression softened at the story, her eyes reflecting the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that the greatest achievements often unfold far from cameras or headlines. The boys eventually wandered back to her side, their excitement about the city model turning into an animated discussion about which building might someday become the tallest in the world. Emily listened to their ideas with patient interest, encouraging each of them as they spoke. The moment felt warm and unhurried, a family simply sharing thoughts beneath the glow of the chandeliers while the skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls. Ryan watched them for a long moment and felt the final pieces of understanding settle into place. Emily had not returned tonight to reclaim a past or challenge an old memory. She had walked into the ballroom because this was simply where her life now belonged. And as the music drifted gently through the room and the city lights shimmered across the windows, Ryan Blake understood that the quiet woman he once believed he had left behind had become someone whose influence reached far beyond anything he had ever expected. The orchestra gradually lowered its volume as a gentle chime echoed through the ballroom, signaling that the formal portion of the evening was about to begin. Conversations softened and guests slowly turned their attention toward the small stage near the center of the room, where a polished wooden podium had been placed beneath a wide arc of crystal light. Daniel Sterling guided Emily and the boys toward the front row where several foundation board members were already taking their seats. The triplets settled beside their parents, their earlier excitement about the city skyline now replaced with quiet curiosity about what would happen next. Across the ballroom, Ryan Blake and Sophia followed the same movement as the crowd began gathering closer to the stage. Ryan felt the quiet tension of anticipation ripple through the room. The Sterling Foundation Gala was known for major announcements that often shaped future investments and social initiatives across the country. Yet tonight, there was a different sense of focus in the air. The attention was no longer centered solely on Daniel Sterling. It rested just as strongly on the woman seated beside him. The host of the evening stepped to the podium and welcomed the guests with warm appreciation, thanking donors, educators, and community leaders who had traveled from across the United States to attend the event. The speech moved through the foundation's accomplishments over the past year, highlighting new hospital wings, expanded scholarships, and educational partnerships that had opened opportunities for thousands of students. Several times the speaker paused to acknowledge the leadership behind those projects. Each time the room responded with polite applause. But when the speaker mentioned Emily Sterling by name, the applause grew noticeably stronger. The recognition was genuine, rising from people who had witnessed the direct impact of her work. Emily remained composed, offering a modest smile before glancing toward the boys beside her who were watching the stage with attentive curiosity. Ryan listened carefully as the presentation continued. Charts appeared on the large screen behind the podium, showing the growth of scholarship programs and new educational centers being built across several states. The speaker explained how the foundation planned to expand its reach even further in the coming years. Then the speaker paused and smiled before announcing that the next part of the evening would be introduced by the person who had originally imagined the scholarship initiative years earlier. A quiet wave of expectation passed through the room. Daniel turned slightly toward Emily, offering a gentle nod that carried both encouragement and pride. Emily rose from her seat with calm grace and walked toward the podium as the audience welcomed her with warm applause. The sound filled the ballroom, echoing against the glass windows that overlooked the glowing skyline of Manhattan. Ryan felt the moment settle deeply within him. The woman standing beneath the stage lights was not the uncertain figure he remembered from the courthouse long ago. She stood with the quiet assurance of someone who had spent years building something meaningful. Emily thanked the audience for their support and began speaking about the power of opportunity. Her voice carried clearly through the room, steady and sincere as she described the first student who had received a foundation scholarship nearly a decade earlier. She spoke about the courage it takes for families to believe that education can change their future. She spoke about communities where hope sometimes feels distant until someone decides to invest in possibility. The room listened in complete silence. Ryan watched her as she spoke and felt the final layer of understanding settle into place. Emily had not simply rebuilt her life after their divorce. She had grown into a leader whose influence now reached far beyond any single room. And as the applause rose again beneath the glow of the chandeliers, Ryan Blake realized that the quiet woman he once believed he had outgrown had become someone whose voice could shape the future of countless lives. The applause continued long after Emily Sterling finished her speech, the sound rising warmly through the ballroom until it echoed softly against the tall glass windows that framed the glowing Manhattan skyline. Emily stood quietly at the podium for a moment, her hands resting lightly along its polished edge as she looked out across the room. The audience that had arrived expecting another evening of elegant conversation and charitable pledges now watched her with a deeper sense of respect. She thanked them again for believing that opportunity should not depend on where a child is born, then stepped away from the microphone with the same calm grace she had carried throughout the evening. Daniel rose from his seat in the front row and greeted her with a quiet smile as she returned to the family. The triplets immediately leaned closer, each of them asking questions about the speech in eager whispers. Alexander wanted to know how many students the program would help next year. Julian wondered whether some of those students might one day design buildings taller than the ones outside the windows. Theodore asked if he could visit one of the schools Emily had mentioned. Emily listened to each question with gentle patience, answering them thoughtfully before guiding the boys back to their seats as the program continued. Across the ballroom, Ryan Blake remained standing among the other guests, though his attention had not moved from the stage since Emily first stepped forward. The speech had been simple and sincere, yet it carried a quiet strength that lingered long after the final words. Ryan realized that the room had not responded to Emily with admiration because she was married to a powerful man. They respected her because she had become powerful in her own way. Sophia stood beside him, her expression thoughtful as she watched the guests who were now approaching Emily to congratulate her personally. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ryan finally exhaled slowly, as if releasing a realization that had taken the entire evening to form. 10 years earlier, he had believed that the future belonged to those who moved the fastest and climbed the highest. Watching Emily tonight had shown him a different truth. Some lives grow quietly until the strength of their roots becomes impossible to ignore. The host returned to the podium to introduce the final portion of the evening, inviting guests to continue supporting the foundation's expanding programs. Waiters moved gracefully through the aisles once again, offering refreshments while soft music returned to the ballroom. Yet the energy in the room had changed. Conversations now carried the hopeful tone of people inspired by what they had just heard. Several donors discussed new partnerships while educators spoke about communities that could benefit from the next phase of scholarships. Emily listened to them with attentive interest, occasionally adding thoughtful suggestions that revealed how carefully she had considered each possibility. Daniel remained close beside her, proud but never overshadowing the work she had clearly helped build. Ryan watched the small family sitting together beneath the chandelier light and felt a quiet understanding settle within him. The story he once believed had ended years ago had not ended at all. It had simply continued beyond the narrow path he had imagined. Emily had not returned to remind him of the past. She had returned as someone entirely new, someone who had turned quiet compassion into lasting influence. And as the music drifted gently through the ballroom and the city lights shimmered across the windows, Ryan Blake understood that the woman he once thought he had left behind had become someone the entire room now looked toward with respect. The ballroom slowly returned to its elegant rhythm after the final round of applause faded, yet the energy in the room remained changed in a way that could not easily be reversed. Guests moved through the marble hall beneath the warm chandelier light, but the quiet admiration surrounding Emily Sterling lingered like a gentle current beneath every conversation. Daniel spoke briefly with several board members near the stage, discussing future partnerships that had been inspired by the speech Emily had delivered only minutes earlier. Across the room, donors approached Emily one by one, thanking her personally for the vision she had shared. She greeted each of them with the same calm warmth, listening carefully as they described communities they hoped the foundation could reach next. The triplets remained close beside her, their attention drifting between the conversations and the glowing skyline outside the windows. Occasionally one of them would whisper a question about something they had heard, and Emily would answer with patient encouragement before returning her focus to the guests. The balance between her role as a mother and a leader unfolded naturally, as though both parts of her life belonged together without conflict. Ryan Blake stood quietly near the edge of the ballroom, watching the scene with a thoughtful stillness he had not felt in years. The evening had slowly reshaped the way he saw the past. For a long time he had believed that success meant leaving certain chapters behind. But tonight had revealed something different. Some chapters do not disappear. They grow quietly into entirely new stories. Sophia glanced toward him and spoke softly, noting how many people seemed eager to speak with Emily now that the presentation had ended. Ryan nodded slowly, recognizing that the attention Emily received was not the result of a single speech or a single evening. It was the result of years of quiet work that had reached far beyond the room they stood in. Across the hall, one of the triplets tugged gently on Emily's sleeve, pointing toward the towering glass windows where the skyline stretched endlessly into the night. Emily followed the child's gaze and smiled, kneeling beside him as he asked which building had been the hardest to construct. Daniel joined them, explaining that every great structure begins with an idea that people are willing to believe in together. The boys listened carefully, their curiosity reflecting the same sense of possibility Emily had described earlier during her speech. Guests nearby paused to watch the moment, smiling at the warmth shared between the family. Ryan observed the scene with quiet reflection. The woman he once remembered as uncertain had become someone whose calm presence shaped the entire room without effort. Yet there was no trace of bitterness in her voice or her expression. Emily did not speak about the past. She spoke about the future and the opportunities still waiting to be created. As the orchestra resumed its gentle melody and waiters began preparing the ballroom for the closing portion of the evening, Ryan felt the final pieces of understanding settle into place. Emily had not returned tonight to prove anything. She had simply continued forward until the life she built became impossible to overlook. And in the soft glow of the chandeliers, with the city lights stretching for miles beyond the glass walls, Ryan Blake understood that the quiet strength he once failed to recognize had grown into something far more enduring than the ambitions he once believed defined success. The final hour of the gala unfolded with a calm elegance that felt almost reflective, as if the entire ballroom had quietly absorbed the meaning of the evening. Guests moved slowly between conversations, the orchestra now playing a gentle, closing arrangement while the city lights beyond the glass windows shimmered across the dark river like a field of distant stars. Emily Sterling stood near the windows with Daniel and the boys, speaking with a small group of educators who had traveled across the country to attend the event. The discussion had turned toward the future, toward the next group of students who would soon receive the scholarships Emily had described earlier. Her voice carried the same steady warmth it had held throughout the evening, never hurried, never searching for attention. She spoke as someone who believed deeply that small opportunities could change entire lives. Daniel listened beside her with quiet pride, occasionally adding a detail about the foundation's plans for expanding their partnerships with schools in underserved communities. The triplets had grown a little tired from the excitement of the evening and now leaned comfortably beside their parents, watching the skyline with soft curiosity as the last guests drifted through the ballroom. Ryan Blake remained near the back of the room, his gaze resting on the family framed by the warm glow of the chandeliers and the distant lights of Manhattan. The evening had shown him something he had not expected to see. For years he had believed that success belonged to those who moved fastest and spoke loudest, those who built towers tall enough to dominate the skyline. Yet the quiet influence surrounding Emily told a different story. Her strength had never been loud. It had simply been patient. Sophia stood beside him, her expression thoughtful as she watched the same scene unfold. She spoke softly, observing that the room seemed calmer around Emily, as if people trusted her presence without needing to question it. Ryan nodded slowly. That calm trust was something money alone could never buy. Across the hall, one of the boys pointed toward a distant cluster of buildings and asked whether those lights belonged to a school or a hospital. Emily knelt beside him and explained that some of them were hospitals that helped families during difficult moments, while others were schools where students were studying late into the night. She told him that every light in the city represented someone trying to build a better future. The boy listened with wide curiosity before smiling and saying that maybe one day he would help build one of those places too. Daniel rested a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder as they listened to the children talk about the future in the simple way only children can. Nearby guests watched the moment quietly, recognizing the rare balance between influence and humility that surrounded the family. Ryan observed the scene for one last long moment. The past he once believed had closed behind him now felt distant and almost unimportant. Emily had not returned to confront old memories or reopen old wounds. She had simply continued forward until her path led somewhere far greater than either of them had imagined years ago. As the orchestra played its final notes and the ballroom lights softened for the evening's close, Ryan Blake understood the truth with quiet clarity. The woman who once signed divorce papers through tears had not been the end of a story. She had been the beginning of a stronger one. And beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, with the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the windows, Emily Sterling stood surrounded by the life she had built with patience, purpose, and quiet strength.